I want better NPCs in JRPGs. Now, the level of NPCs varies across JRPGs. There are some games where the NPCs are very detailed. They have names, they have backstories, they have stories throughout the games, and I'm kind of referring to the Trails games. They do this very well. There are JRPGs where NPCs are kind of like a non-entity. They're called like Man 1 and Man 2, or they have no names and they just say generic bullshit. There are games where there's NPCs you can't even talk to. They're just standing there. And so there's a huge range of NPCs in JRPGs, and I'm definitely on the side of having NPCs that actually matter. But pretty much like I want NPCs more often that are named, that have stories that evolve throughout the games. Let's refer to a specific game, Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure. It is more of a small scale game. Usually the towns are a lot smaller. Let's say each town has maybe, I don't know, say 20, 25 NPCs. Those NPCs are written so well. They each have a specific name. They each have a specific story, where if you talk to those NPCs at different points of the story throughout Trails from Zero and Trails to Azure, you will see the story develop throughout both the games, like with full continuity. And what's amazing is if you talk to every single NPC as I do, you'll sometimes get hints of story beats before they happen. Yeah, I just think NPCs are such a good vehicle to like give story. It just becomes very disappointing when NPCs are just there in a game just to fill space, where like if you want to make a city busier, you can just add a bunch of NPCs that don't really add anything to it. One example I'll give of negative NPCs, now I do want to preface this by saying is I never played this game for a long time. I played this game for 10 hours, so for all I know the NPCs become very great in the rest of the game. But in the 10 hours I played of Persona 5, the NPCs sucked in it. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because at the time of me playing Persona 5, I was playing Trails of Cold Steel. And if you play Trails of Cold Steel, you know that every single, or pretty much every single student in the school of Trails of Cold Steel has a name, they have a story, and later in the future games, they become very important to the plot in specific ways. In Persona 5, when I was in the school, not only could you not talk to most students didn't even have a design. Like their heads were literally like blank. And so when I played that after going to Cold Steel, I was just very disappointed. Where like pretty much the only students you could like talk to meaningfully were like the ones that were in your crew. Because of that, like I didn't give a fuck about the school. I didn't care about the students. I didn't really care about the school at all. Now, I don't know if that's intentional. Again, I only played 10 hours of the what I think is like a 100+ hour game, so maybe it gets better. But from my experience there, the NPCs were like badly made. But again, it could be intentional, I'm not sure. Where Trails games, the students were named. So let me give you an example from the Trails of Cold Steel games. There's a bunch of students. There were 2 students, this guy and girl, where you would, if you just talk to them randomly throughout the game, you would notice that they kind of like have a back and forth of doing businesses. So like whenever like a school festival came up, they would be like arguing like, oh, we should have a stand at this festival and we should sell this. And they'd be kind of arguing like, oh no, we should do the stand this way, or we should sell this instead, or blah blah blah. And that's pretty much their dynamic. It's just kind of like this back and forth attitude, how they're kind of friendly but argue a lot. Whenever there was a school festival, you'll see that sometimes they have a stand. I think sometimes they have separate stands, maybe sometimes they have shared stands. I can't remember the specifics. The reason I'm bringing this up is later in the series, like I think the 3rd and 4th games, there's like a small time skip of a couple of years. They actually are brought into the plot in interesting ways, where like the guy student who was more like business oriented and less value oriented, turns out he was like the son of like a big company, and he becomes like antagonistic in a way where like he's funding a company which ends up being our enemy in the future game. So like if you were following him from the early Trails games, you kind of saw that coming, like in terms of like his values, and you could kind of see how that matches. Whereas if you didn't talk to him, like it would just be a plot point, like you wouldn't really care about it. The girl NPC who was more like into the values of business, and she actually cared about like pleasing the customer more, she ends up becoming like the person who runs the store for the good guys. Like she's like with us on her ship, she's selling stuff to us, and she really has a good network in terms of getting us connected to other merchandising people and stuff like that. And so she comes onto our side. And so again, if you didn't talk to her and she just showed up in the 3rd game and she's just like your storefront, you'd be like, okay, like she was a student in the past, cool. But because I've been talking to her throughout the first 2 games and I kind of know what she values, when she came in Trails of Cold Steel 3, I was like, oh holy fuck, it's you. Yeah, I remember you, and like I remember like what you were about, and you're like the storefront for us. That's pretty cool. And like it made a lot of sense. So whenever like those moments that clicked in, it really clicked in. Like it felt really good to see how these characters actually evolved, and it actually made them feel like characters and not just like random NPCs. And I'm just talking about 2 students in the school. There's a bunch of examples of like there's this photographer student and he becomes important as a photographer. There's these twins and they do other things that become important to the plot too. And like pretty much every single student becomes that. Don't get me wrong, there are some students that are like generic. I think there are some students that are literally called like boy 1 and girl 1 and stuff like that in Trails, and they obviously aren't important. But the point is, so much much of the students at the time of Trails of Colossia 1 and 2, I didn't know they would become important. I just talked to them because I felt like it, because they seemed interesting enough, and they ended up becoming important to the plot, which is really cool. And you see this in the Trails from Zero and Azure games, where like if you like talk to this boy in this like farm village, he'll tell you like, hey, I just moved here, I don't really like this village, and throughout the game you'll slowly see him warm up to the village residents, and he ends up really loving the village. And I'm talking about this plot happening over 2 games, so it's like very like slow running, but it's very satisfying when you get to the end of these plot lines, because you kind of get to see these characters change over the game. And that specific NPC has nothing to do with the story. You can cut him out of the game, the NPC, and it won't affect it. But there are other NPCs which I'll bring up now, where like I would talk to every single NPC in the town, right? And so there'd be like a dad of the family, which like you find out like he works in stocks or something, and he just talk about his business once in a while. And there's like this other like gang member, like the youngest gang member, who's kind of like fiery and has like a shitty attitude, but he's an NPC you can talk to sometimes too. So those are just 2 I'm bringing up in this entire city. But I would talk to them and they would be talking about what they usually do, but slowly you'll end up noticing that they're just getting like more depressed because of their individual situations. And like over hours and hours of the game, you'll notice that they're slowly degrading in terms of that. And at some point you'll notice that their behavior changes, and you'll only notice this if you've really been paying attention. If you just talk to them randomly, you probably wouldn't notice, but like they start acting out of character. The young gang member who usually respects his elders is being an asshole to the elders. The dad who's usually very nice is becoming an asshole to his wife and kids. If you're just, you know, like talking to them, you wonder kind of what's going on. And at some point through more hours of the game, they just disappear. Like they're just gone out of like where they usually are. So if you go to the dad's house, the wife and the kid are there, and they're wondering like what the hell happened to the dad. If you go to the gang, they're like, yeah, I don't know where the youngest gang member went, like he was here yesterday. Hours and hours later in the story, you find out that the main villain like took like random residents of the town and kidnapped them to like drug them or something. And so if you talked to the NPCs like I did, you saw the buildup of these characters. I care about these characters at this point, and you kind of put 2 and 2 together, like, oh, these guys were kind of in this depressive episode and they randomly started acting out of character. They were probably given drugs and that's why they were acting weird. And so that's something, when that happened, I was like, oh, I immediately knew exactly which NPCs in the town were taken, and I was able to go to each of their locations without an issue. Whereas if I was just playing the story and I was told like, oh yeah, these random 4 NPCs were like kidnapped and drugged, and like I just didn't know them, I'd be like, okay, and then I would have to find them, like go to a random house, like, okay, this guy was drugged, I don't know who this guy is, okay, this gang member I guess was drugged. Like I just wouldn't give a shit. But like at that point I was like, yo, I care about these NPCs. I know that freaking dad, like he's a freaking good dude to his daughter, I want to help him out. And so like it creates a different type of connection with the NPCs just because they're given a story. Literally it's a lot of work, but all you have to do is just like have writers give them these characters and be like, can you just write them like a simple linear story that takes place within these 2 games, and you're good. And then just have the dialogue take place throughout the hours of the game, and like it really pays off. Like the NPCs and Trails, just like there's no other game that just really touches it at all. And you can talk to every single NPC in Trails 2, and they all have like multiple lines of dialogue. It feels so feature rich in terms of like the story you get out of the characters, where like it's just so satisfying to play if you play that way. And yeah, that's pretty much what I want to bring up. I know it's getting kind of rambly, but like the NPCs and like the Trails games, or games that do it this way, are just so much more satisfying than like games that you either cannot talk to NPCs, or if you do, they just bring up something like generic, like, oh hey, what's up man, don't even have that NPC. I'd rather have a game that has, like, for example, like in the Trails games, say a smaller town, and there's only 12 NPCs in that town, which doesn't really make sense from a town point of view, but they're all like detailed like I mentioned. I'd rather have that than have like 50 residents in the town and they're all like nameless, and most of them don't talk to you, and when they do talk to you, they don't add anything to the story really. Like I don't care about that. Like don't just add NPCs for the sake of filling in the town. Like add NPCs that actually make the story and the gameplay experience more satisfying to play. So every time I play a JRPG, one of the first things I check is, okay, let's see how they do the NPCs. I try to go and talk to them. I kind of prod each of them to see if they will talk to me and what level of detail answers they will give to me. But yeah, better NPCs. It needs to be a thing that comes to JRPGs more, and all it really needs is hopefully better writing from the writing team, and that is something that is pretty achievable.